The rain began at 11:47 p.m., hammering the tin roof of Lucía Morales's adobe house like angry fists demanding entry. She knew the exact time because she'd been staring at the digital clock beside her bed for the past 3 hours, watching the red numbers flip in the darkness while thunder rolled across the jagged peaks of the Sangre de Cristo mountains. Sleep had become a stranger since Tomás died, especially on nights when the weather turned violent, when the wind howled like a wounded animal and the rain transformed from gentle droplets into liquid bullets. The meteorologist on Channel 7 had warned about flash floods during the evening broadcast, his usually calm demeanor cracking as he explained how the high desert couldn't absorb this much water this fast, how the arroyos would fill like bathtubs and overflow their banks within hours. But warnings meant nothing when you lived on Rabbit Ridge, 2 miles up a winding dirt road that the county barely maintained, where cell service was spotty on good days and non-existent during storms. When the power flickered out at midnight, plunging her world into absolute darkness, save for the occasional strobing of lightning, Lucía finally understood that tonight would be different from all the other sleepless nights she'd endured since becoming a widow. The rain wasn't just falling, it was attacking, each drop a liquid bullet aimed at washing away everything she'd tried so desperately to rebuild in the year since her husband's funeral. What she couldn't have predicted, what no amount of grief-fueled insomnia could have prepared her for, was that before dawn, painted the mountains purple and gold, 2 strangers would arrive at her door, carrying secrets that would force her to choose between the safety of silence and the dangerous mercy of truth. She lit 3 votive candles with matches from the kitchen drawer, their flames casting dancing shadows on the walls where Tomás's photographs still hung in their handmade wooden frames. The house felt smaller in the flickering light, more like a cave than the home they'd shared for 12 years, where they'd planned children that never came and dreamed of growing old together on this ridge overlooking the Rio Grande Valley. The scent of melted wax, mixed with the earthy smell of rain seeping through the old adobe walls, creating an atmosphere both cozy and melancholy. Outside, the wind shrieked through the ancient piñón pines that Tomás had refused to cut down, despite their proximity to the house. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the kitchen window, she could hear the distant roar of Willow Creek swelling. Beyond its banks, carrying with it the detritus of the high country, fallen trees, boulders, and probably the remains of someone's fence or outbuilding. The house creaked and settled around her, familiar sounds amplified by the storm. Every board and beam held memories. The squeaky floorboard in the hallway, where Tomás used to pause before entering their bedroom after late-night construction jobs, trying not to wake her. The loose window frame in the kitchen that rattled during winter winds, which he'd always promised to fix next weekend, the way the whole structure seemed to sigh when the temperature dropped, as if the adobe itself was breathing. Tonight, those sounds felt different, not comforting but lonely, emphasizing her solitude in a way that daylight somehow masked. If you're finding yourself drawn into this story of loss, redemption, and the storms that reshape our lives both, literally and metaphorically, I'd love for you to join our community of storytellers who believe that the most profound truths often emerge from our darkest hours. Hit that subscribe button and let's explore these moments that define us together. Lucía wrapped her grandmother's quilt around her shoulders and padded to the kitchen in her bare feet, the tile floor cold against her skin, despite the August heat that had baked the high desert all week. She put the kettle on the gas stove. One advantage of living off the main grid was that propane didn't care about power outages, and selected a bag of chamomile tea from the wooden box Tomás had made her. For their 10th anniversary, the familiar ritual of making tea in the middle of the night had become her way of marking time during the endless hours between sunset and sunrise, when grief felt heaviest and sleep seemed most elusive. As she waited for the water to boil, she found herself studying the kitchen in the candlelight, noting details that the harsh fluorescent fixture usually washed out. The way the hand-painted tiles above the stove caught and reflected the flame. The collection of wooden spoons in the ceramic jar, each one worn smooth by years of use, some carved by Tomás himself during the winter evenings when construction work was scarce. The small altar in the corner, really just a shelf, where she kept a photograph of her parents alongside a statue of Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe and a candle that she lit every morning and evening, a habit that connected her to her grandmother's faith, even when her own felt shaky. The kettle's whistle seemed unnaturally loud in the storm-wrapped silence, and she poured the steaming water over the tea bag, inhaling the soothing herbal scent. Chamomile was supposed to promote sleep, though it had failed her consistently since Tomás's accident. Still, the warmth of the mug in her hands and the routine of steeping, stirring and sipping provided a small comfort, an anchor of normalcy. In a world that had felt fundamentally unstable since that rainy night 12 months ago, the knock came at 12:38 a.m., sharp and desperate against her front door, the sound cutting through the storm's fury like a blade. Lucía froze in her kitchen, the mug of chamomile tea cooling in her trembling hands, steam still rising from its surface. Nobody drove up Rabbit Ridge in weather like this. The road was treacherous on good days, narrow, winding, with a steep drop-off on one side and loose rock faces on the other. In conditions like tonight's deluge, it would be nearly impassable, carved into muddy channels by the runoff, with washouts likely every few hundred yards. She'd learned to be cautious living, alone up here, especially after dark. Tomás had installed a security light and deadbolt after the Hernandez house down the valley was broken into 2 summers ago, and he'd made her promise to always check through the peephole before opening the door to strangers. But the security light was useless without electricity, and the peephole revealed nothing but darkness. "Please," a man's voice called through the heavy wooden door, barely audible above the storm's roar. The voice was young, strained with desperation and exhaustion. "My sister, she needs help. She's having a baby." The words hit Lucía like a physical blow. A baby. She pressed her hand to her stomach, where her own pregnancy had ended at 19 weeks, where Tomás's child had stopped growing for reasons the doctors could never fully explain. The phantom pain of that loss still visited her sometimes, usually in moments like this, when she was tired and vulnerable. Through the rain-lashed window beside the door, she caught glimpses of 2 figures huddled on her covered porch in the intermittent lightning flashes. One was clearly pregnant, her silhouette unmistakable even in the strobing light, round-bellied, leaning heavily against what appeared to be a younger man. Both were soaked to the bone, their clothes clinging to their bodies like second skins, hair plastered to their skulls by the relentless rain. Her hand hesitated on the deadbolt as Tomás's voice echoed in her memory. "Mountain people look out for each other, especially during storms. That's how we survive up here, by taking care of our neighbors, even the ones we don't know yet." He'd always said that community wasn't just about the people you saw at church or the grocery store, but about recognizing your shared humanity with anyone who needed help. But Tomás was gone, and she'd spent the past year learning that the world could be crueler and more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. The investigating officer who'd knocked on her door that terrible night had been kind but blunt. There were bad people out there who preyed on isolated women, who used emergencies as excuses to gain entry to homes, who counted on feminine compassion as a weakness to exploit. "Ma'am, please," the man called again, his voice cracking with emotion. "Rosa's having contractions every few minutes. We got caught in the flood, trying to reach the hospital in Española. Our car got washed off the road about a mile down. She can't walk much further." The woman, Rosa, let out a low moan that cut through the wind like a blade, primal and unmistakable. It was the sound of a woman in active labor, a sound that awakened something deep and instinctive in Lucia's chest. Her maternal instincts, dormant for the 2 decades since her miscarriage, suddenly flared to life with an intensity that surprised her. She thought of the pregnant women she'd known over the years. Her sister Carmen, who'd had 3 children. Her neighbor Mrs. Valdez, who'd given birth to twins at home when the ambulance couldn't make it up the mountain during a blizzard. The young women at church who'd asked her for advice about pregnancy and childbirth, not knowing about her own loss. She'd read every book, watched every documentary, absorbed every piece of information she could find about labor and delivery during those hopeful months when she carried her own child. The knowledge was still there, stored away like tools in a shed, waiting for a moment when it might be needed. Lucía unlatched the door and swung it open, warm candlelight spilling onto the porch like liquid gold. The pregnant woman was young, maybe 25, with kind brown eyes and caramel-colored skin that glowed with perspiration despite the cool rain. She had long black hair that hung in wet ropes around her shoulders, and she wore a simple cotton dress that was stretched tight across her swollen belly. She leaned heavily against the man, presumably her brother, who looked to be about 30, with the lean, wiry build of someone who worked construction or ranch jobs. His face was angular and weathered by sun and wind, with intelligent dark eyes that held a mixture of relief and wariness as they met Lucia's gaze. "Get inside," Lucía said, stepping back to make room. "Both of you, quickly!" They stumbled across the threshold like refugees, water pooling on her tile floor in ever-expanding puddles. Rosa's breathing was labored, each exhalation a small puff of white vapor in the cooler indoor air. Her face was drawn with pain and exhaustion, but there was a determination in her eyes that spoke of inner strength. The man looked around the candlelit room with something that might have been recognition, though Lucía couldn't place him. There was something familiar about the set of his shoulders, the way he held his head, but grief had made her memory unreliable. "I'm Matteo," he said, supporting his sister's weight with practiced ease. "Matteo Sandoval, this is Rosa. Thank you for letting us in. I know it's dangerous, opening your door to strangers in the middle of the night." His honesty surprised her. Most people would have glossed over the risk, would have offered immediate reassurances about their harmlessness. Instead, he acknowledged the courage her kindness required, which somehow made him seem more trustworthy rather than less. Lucía hurried to the linen closet and returned with an armload of towels, the thick cotton ones she saved for guests, along with a pair of Tomas's old sweatpants and one of his flannel shirts. "Here, get out of those wet clothes before you catch pneumonia. Rosa, how far apart are your contractions?" "Maybe 6 minutes now," Rosa whispered, accepting the dry clothes gratefully. "They started around 10 o'clock. We were trying to get to Presbyterian Hospital in Española, but Highway 84 is completely underwater. We saw cars floating, people stranded on their roofs." Lucía nodded grimly. She'd heard the emergency broadcasts before the power died. State Route 84 was closed from the Pueblo all the way to the Colorado border. The Rio Grande and its tributaries had jumped their banks simultaneously, turning the entire valley into a temporary lake. Even if they could somehow reach the main road, which was highly doubtful given the washouts on her own access route, there was nowhere to go. The nearest hospital was 40 miles away on roads that were now rivers. "We need to call 911, Matteo said, pulling out a cell phone with a spider web of cracks across its screen. "Get a helicopter or—" He stared at the device, then held it, higher toward the ceiling, searching desperately for signal bars that refused to appear. "Nothing. Can you try yours?" Lucía retrieved her own phone from the kitchen counter, but it was equally useless. The nearest cell tower was on Truchas Peak, and storms like this often knocked out the relay equipment. They were truly cut off from the outside world. 3 souls in a candlelit house with a baby that seemed determined to make its entrance whether there was medical help available or not. While Rosa changed into the dry clothes in the bedroom, Lucía assessed their situation with the kind of clear-headed practicality that had helped her survive the past year. She'd never actually delivered a baby herself, but she'd assisted at enough births in the rural community to know the basics. Her uncle's ranch had taught her about animal births, not the same as human delivery, but the fundamental principles were similar. And there had been that terrible winter 5 years ago when Mrs. Valdez went into labor during a blizzard, and Lucía had been the only other woman available to help until the volunteer paramedic could ski up the mountain. She began gathering supplies. With methodical efficiency, clean sheets and towels from the linen closet, a plastic tablecloth to protect the mattress, her well-stocked first aid kit with antiseptic, gauze, and surgical scissors that Thomas had insisted on keeping sharp. She found her camping lantern in the utility closet and checked the batteries. Still strong. Not ideal conditions for childbirth, but women had been having babies by candlelight for thousands of years, before hospitals and epidurals became the norm. Rosa emerged from the bedroom, swimming in Tomas's clothes, the flannel shirt hanging nearly to her knees, the sweatpants rolled up at the ankles. She looked impossibly young in the oversized garments, more like a child playing dress-up than a woman about to become a mother. But there was steel in her spine as another contraction gripped her, and she breathed through it with the kind of focused concentration that suggested she'd been practicing. "They're getting closer," she said when the pain passed. "Maybe 4 minutes now, and stronger. Like my whole body is squeezing." Lucía helped her settle on the couch, propping pillows behind her back for support. "That's normal. Your body is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. How long have you been pregnant?" 39 weeks, Rosa replied. "Due next week. The baby's been moving around a lot today, like she knows something's happening." "She?" "We think so. The ultrasound tech wasn't completely sure, but she had a feeling." Rosa placed both hands on her belly, and Lucía could see the outline of tiny limbs pressing against the stretched skin. "Miguel. That's her father. He wanted to wait to find out. But I was too impatient." "Where's Miguel now?" Rosa's face clouded. "Afghanistan. He's supposed to come home next month after his deployment ends. I wanted to wait for him, but babies don't follow deployment schedules." Mateo had been pacing near the window, occasionally, peering out at the storm that showed no signs of abating. The lightning was almost continuous now, and in its harsh white light, Lucía could see actual streams of water rushing past the house, not just rain, but runoff from the higher elevations carrying debris and mud in a brown torrent. The valley's underwater by now," Mateo said, echoing her thoughts. He spoke with the authority of someone who knew this country well. "Remember the flood of 2008? When the Rodriguez place got swept clean off its foundation?" Lucía nodded, then paused. Something about his tone suggested more than casual knowledge of local history. She studied his profile in the candlelight, noting the sharp angle of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders with a slight forward hunch as if carrying invisible weight. There was something familiar about him, though she couldn't place what. In a small mountain community, faces tended to blur together over the years. The children of people she'd known growing up, relatives visiting from Albuquerque or Santa Fe, seasonal workers who came and went with construction projects and harvest seasons. "Were you living here during the 2008 flood?" she asked carefully. "I grew up in Española," he said, without turning from the window. "Used to work the freight runs up and down Highway 84 during the busy seasons. Hauled supplies to all these little mountain towns, saw what water could do when it got angry. Freight runs." The phrase sent an unexpected chill down Lucia's spine, like ice water suddenly injected into her veins. Tomás had died on a rainy night exactly like this one, hydroplaning on his way back from a delivery to a construction site up near Los Alamos. The investigating officer had said another truck had been following too close, that when Tomás's pickup started to skid on the slick asphalt, the freight truck behind him had jackknifed, trying to avoid the collision. The driver and his helper had walked away from the scene without serious injury, while Tomás died, trapped in his overturned truck, slowly drowning in the ditch water that rose around him as the storm continued. She shook off the memory, forcing herself to focus on the present crisis. Plenty of men drove freight in northern New Mexico. It was one of the few jobs that paid decent wages without requiring a college degree. The coincidence was unsettling, but coincidences happened all the time in small communities where everyone's lives intersected in unexpected ways. Rosa had another contraction, this one strong enough to make her cry out and grip the arm of the couch with white-knuckled intensity. When it ended, she was breathing hard, her face flushed and damp with perspiration. "I think the baby's coming soon," she whispered, fear creeping into her voice for the first time. "I can feel pressure, like she wants to push. Is that normal?" "It's completely normal," Lucía assured her, though her own anxiety was mounting. "Let's check how far along you are." She helped Rosa lie back on the couch and examined her as gently as possible, grateful for the knowledge she'd absorbed during those hopeful months of her own pregnancy, when she'd read every book and watched every video she could find. Even with her limited hands-on experience, she could tell that Rosa was well into active labor. The baby was definitely coming, and soon. "You're almost fully dilated," she told Rosa. "Maybe 8 centimeters. We need to prepare for this baby to arrive within the next hour or two." Mateo turned from the window, his face pale in the candlelight. "Is that good or bad?" "It's fast for a first baby, but not dangerously so. Some women labor for 20 hours. Others deliver in the car on the way to the hospital. Every birth is different." As if summoned by their conversation, Rosa's water broke with a sudden gush that soaked through the towels they'd placed under her and onto the couch cushions. She looked up at Lucía with wide, frightened eyes, and for a moment she looked like exactly what she was, a young woman far from home, about to become a mother without any of the medical support she'd planned on. "That's perfectly normal," Lucía said quickly, though her own heart was racing. "It means things are progressing exactly as they should. Let's get you more comfortable." She and Mateo worked together to rearrange the living room, moving the coffee table against the wall and spreading clean sheets on the floor near the fireplace where it would be warmest. They arranged pillows and blankets to create a nest-like space, as cozy and welcoming as they could manage under the circumstances. The candles provided surprisingly good light, and the camping lantern added a steady white glow that made everything seem less dramatic and more manageable. "You really seem to know what you're doing," Mateo observed as they worked. "I've seen some things," Lucía replied simply. She didn't mention the extensive research she'd done during her own pregnancy, the classes she'd taken at the hospital in Santa Fe, the midwifery books she'd read cover to cover. Those memories belonged to a different version of herself, one who had believed that love and preparation were enough to guarantee a happy ending. The next contraction came barely 3 minutes after the last one, intense and demanding. Rosa gripped Lucía's hand so hard her knuckles went white, and for the first time her body began to push involuntarily, following an instinct older than civilization. "I can't do this," Rosa panted when the contraction passed. "It hurts too. Much. I need an epidural, I need doctors, I need—" She looked around wildly at the candlelit room, at the storm raging outside, at the reality of her situation finally sinking in completely. "You can do this," Lucía said firmly, taking Rosa's face in her hands and forcing eye contact. "Women have been doing this since the beginning of human history. Your body knows exactly what to do, even if your mind is scared. You're stronger than you think. But even as she spoke the reassuring words, she felt her own anxiety mounting like floodwater behind a dam. What if there were complications? What if the baby was breech, or the umbilical cord was wrapped around its neck? What if Rosa hemorrhaged after delivery? What if the baby didn't breathe immediately after birth? They were completely alone, with no way to call for help and no way to reach medical care, dependent entirely on her limited knowledge and Rosa's body's ability to do what it had evolved to do. Another contraction gripped Rosa, and this time, she pushed with conscious effort, her face contorting with the enormous physical strain. Mateo knelt beside her, holding her free hand and murmuring words of encouragement in rapid Spanish, prayers, promises, endearments that seemed to come from some deep well of love and protectiveness. The storm outside seemed to respond to the drama unfolding within the house, as if nature itself was bearing down in sympathy with Rosa's labor. Thunder shook the windows so hard that the glass rattled in its frames, and rain lashed against the adobe walls with renewed fury. In the brief illumination of lightning strikes, Lucía could see that Willow Creek had definitely jumped its banks. What had been a modest stream that morning was now a raging torrent, carrying fence posts, propane tanks, and what looked like part of someone's roof. "I can see the baby's head," Lucía announced, checking Rosa's progress. "Dark hair, lots of it. Everything looks perfect." Rosa let out a sob that was equal parts pain, relief, and terror. "Is she okay? Can you tell if she's okay?" "The head looks beautiful," Lucía said, though in the dim light it was impossible to assess much beyond basic position. "On your next contraction, I need you to push as hard as you can." The contraction built slowly, like a wave gathering strength, and Rosa bore down with everything she had. The baby's head emerged fully, followed by one small shoulder. Then the other. Lucía supported the tiny, slippery body as it slipped into her hands, warm and surprisingly heavy, incredibly and miraculously alive. "It's a girl," she announced, her voice thick with emotion she hadn't expected. "She's absolutely beautiful." The baby let out a lusty cry that filled the candle-lit room, strong and indignant, as if protesting this sudden change from the warm darkness of the womb to the bright, cold world outside. Rosa began sobbing with relief and overwhelming joy, reaching out with trembling arms for her daughter. Mateo leaned over to look at his niece, tears streaming down his weathered face. "She's perfect," he whispered in wonder. "Rosa, she's absolutely perfect. Look at those tiny fingers. Look at her little nose." Lucía quickly cleared the baby's mouth and nose with a clean cloth, then wrapped her in the softest towel she could find and placed her on Rosa's chest, skin to skin. The tiny girl had a shock of dark hair that was already beginning to curl as it dried, her mother's delicate bone structure, and surprisingly alert dark eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with serious consideration. "Hello, mi amor," Rosa whispered to her daughter, her voice breaking with emotion. "I'm your mama. I've been waiting so long to meet you." The baby's cries gradually quieted as she found her mother's breast and began to nurse with the instinctive knowledge that had guided human infants for millennia. The sight was so natural, so fundamentally right, that Lucía felt tears spring to her own eyes. This was what she had dreamed of during those hopeful months of her own pregnancy, holding her child, seeing Tomás become a father, welcoming new life into their mountain home. "We still need to deliver the placenta," she said, forcing herself to focus on the medical necessities, "and then we'll get you both cleaned up properly." The afterbirth came without complications about 15 minutes later, and Lucía was relieved to see that Rosa's bleeding was normal, heavy but not alarmingly so. She helped clean both mother and baby, marveling at how perfectly formed the infant was. how her tiny fingernails were already fully developed, how she seemed to know exactly how to breathe and eat and exist in this new world she'd entered during the storm. As she worked, Lucía felt something fundamental shifting inside her own chest, a loosening of the tight knot of grief and isolation she'd carried for the past year like a physical weight. This wasn't her baby, this wasn't the motherhood she'd dreamed of, but somehow being present for this birth, being useful in this profound way, had awakened something in her that she'd thought was permanently broken. "Thank you," Rosa said, holding her daughter close while the baby slept peacefully against her chest. "I don't know what we would have done without you. You saved us both tonight." Lucía nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. She busied herself cleaning up the medical supplies and checking on their makeshift delivery room, giving the new family a few moments of privacy to bond. As she worked, she became aware that the storm outside was finally beginning to ease. The thunder was more distant now, rolling away toward the eastern mountains, and the rain had softened from a punishing deluge to a steady but manageable downpour. "Sounds like the worst is passing," Matteo observed, echoing her thoughts. He was sitting close to his sister, one finger extended so the baby could wrap her tiny fist around it. "The rain anyway," Lucía agreed. "But the flooding will take hours to recede, maybe days, depending on how much snow melted up high. You'll need to stay here at least until morning, probably longer." She meant it as a simple statement of practical fact, but something in Matteo's expression made her pause. He looked worried, almost fearful, in a way that had nothing to do with his sister's successful delivery or the natural concerns of new parenthood. "Is there somewhere else you need to be?" she asked carefully. He glanced at Rosa, who was absorbed in counting her daughter's impossibly small toes and didn't seem to be listening to their conversation. "It's complicated," he said quietly. "There might be people looking for me, people who wouldn't understand why I'm here, why I was traveling with Rosa during the storm." "What kind of people?" Before he could answer, they heard the distinctive sound of multiple vehicles approaching on the muddy road, engines straining against the rough conditions. Headlights swept across the rain-streaked windows as what sounded like a convoy made its way slowly up the ridge. Matteo went rigid, his face draining of color so completely that he looked like he might faint. "They found us," he whispered, panic creeping into his voice. Lucía moved to the window and peered through the curtain. In the intermittent lightning and the vehicle's headlights, she could count at least 4 pickup trucks and what looked like the sheriff's department SUV making their way carefully up her normally impassable driveway. Men were getting out of the vehicles, some carrying powerful flashlights, others holding objects that could have been tools but might just as easily have been weapons. "Matteo Sandoval," a voice called through the diminishing rain, amplified by what sounded like a battery-powered bullhorn. "We know you're in there. Come on out and nobody has to get hurt tonight." Rosa looked up from nursing her baby, fear replacing the peaceful joy that had filled her face just moments before. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice tight with alarm. "Who are those people? Why do they want Matteo?" Matteo was backing away from the window, his hands shaking visibly. "They think I killed someone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They think I'm responsible for a man's death, and they've been hunting me for over a year." "Did you?" Lucía asked, though she was already beginning to guess the answer with a horrible, sinking certainty. "No," he said fiercely, meeting her eyes with desperate honesty, "but I was there when it happened. I was in the truck when the accident occurred, and when everything went wrong, I ran. I was 19 and scared and stupid, and I ran instead of staying to help. Now they think that makes me guilty of murder." The pieces were falling into place with terrible clarity, like puzzle pieces sliding together to form a picture she didn't want to see. A freight truck following too close on. A rainy night. A young man who ran from the scene of an accident. A victim who died alone while the witnesses disappeared into the darkness. Lucía felt the blood drain from her face as the full realization hit her like a physical blow. "Tomás Morales," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the sound of Rosa trying to calm her increasingly agitated baby. "You were there the night my husband died." Mateo's eyes widened with recognition as he finally placed her face, her name, the significance of this particular house on this particular ridge. "You're his wife," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Oh God, you're Lucía. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Outside, the crowd was growing more restless by the minute. Someone pounded on the front door with enough force to rattle the hinges, making Rosa jump and the baby begin to cry in earnest. "Open up, Mrs. Morales," a familiar voice called through the heavy wood. It was Jim Peterson, who owned the hardware store in town and had been one of the pallbearers at Tomás's funeral. "We know you've got a guest in there. We just want to have a conversation with him." "They don't want to talk," Mateo said desperately, his voice rising with panic. "They've been hunting me since word got around that I was in that truck. They want blood, they want revenge, and they don't care about the truth." "Then tell me the truth," Lucía said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Right now, before this goes any further. Tell me exactly what happened to my husband." Rosa was trying to soothe her crying daughter while simultaneously preparing to flee, though there was nowhere to go in the isolated house surrounded by floodwater and angry men. The baby seemed to sense the tension in the room, her cries becoming more frantic despite her mother's efforts to calm her. "Why didn't you go?" "To the police?" Lucía continued, her voice growing stronger. "If you didn't do anything wrong, if it was just an accident." "Because I was 19 years old and terrified," Mateo said, the words pouring out of him like water breaking through a dam. "Because I had marijuana in my pocket and a juvenile record for petty theft. Because Danny, the driver, told me to run and said he'd handle everything, that if anyone found out he'd been drinking, he'd lose his commercial license and his job and everything he'd worked for." The crowd outside was getting more agitated. Someone threw something at the house, a rock or piece of broken concrete, and it struck the kitchen window with enough force to spiderweb the glass. The baby's cries intensified, a sound that seemed to cut through all the other noise and focus everyone's attention on what was really at stake here. "They're going to break down that door," Rosa said, clutching her newborn daughter protectively against her chest. "What's going to happen to my baby? What's going to happen to us?" Lucía looked at the young woman who had just given birth on her living room floor, at the brother who had carried her through flood and storm to safety, at the tiny baby whose first breaths had been taken in her home by candlelight. She thought about Tomás, about the year of grief and unanswered questions she'd endured, about the whispers and speculation that had followed his death through their small community. But she also thought about justice, about mercy, about the difference between revenge and healing. She thought about the baby who was crying in her living room, who deserved to grow up knowing her uncle as a man who had made mistakes but tried to make them right, not as a victim of mob violence. "Tell me the rest," she said quietly. "Everything that happened that night." Mateo glanced toward the door, where the voices of the crowd were becoming increasingly hostile, then back at his sister and niece. "We were hauling lumber and roofing supplies up to a construction site near Los Alamos," he said, speaking quickly now. "It had been raining all day, and Highway 84 was slick as ice. Danny had been drinking, not falling down drunk, but enough to slow his reflexes, enough that he should never have been behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler. "Mrs. Morales," another voice from outside, angrier and less patient than Jim Peterson's, "we're losing patience out here. Send out the coward, or we're coming in to get him." "Your husband's pickup started sliding in front of us," Mateo continued, his voice becoming more urgent. "I could see it happening in slow motion, the back end coming around, the truck starting to spin. Danny hit the brakes, but we were too close, going too fast for the conditions. We jackknifed trying to avoid the collision, and I watched your husband's truck roll down the embankment." Lucía closed her eyes, picturing the scene she'd imagined 1,000 times over the past year. Was he still alive when you got down there? "I don't know," Matteo said, tears streaming down his face now. "Danny wouldn't let me go down to check. He said the truck was too unstable, that we might make things worse. But then he got scared about the drinking, about losing his job, and he said we had to leave before the police arrived. He said he'd call it in anonymously once we got back to town." "But he didn't," Lucía said quietly. "No. He reported it as a single vehicle accident, made it look like your husband lost control all by himself. By the time I realized what Danny had done, the official report was filed and your husband was being blamed for his own death. I was just a scared kid who didn't know how to tell the truth without destroying my own life." Another rock struck the house, shattering the remaining kitchen window. Glass scattered across the floor as cold air rushed in, making the candles flicker. "This ends now," Jim Peterson shouted. "Send him out or we're coming in." Lucía stood slowly, her mind clear for the first time in a year. "I'm going out there." "No," Matteo said desperately. "They're not rational. Someone could get hurt." "Someone's going to get hurt anyway," Lucía replied, looking at Rosa and her newborn daughter. "But it won't be this baby or her mother." She walked to the door with steady steps and opened it to face the angry crowd of 20 men with flashlights and makeshift weapons standing in her yard. "Mrs. Morales," Jim Peterson stepped forward, "we don't want trouble with you. Just send out the man who killed your husband." "He didn't kill my husband," Lucía said clearly. "And I should know." The crowd murmured in confusion as she stepped into the yard, rain falling gently on her face. "I've spent a year wondering if Tomas's death was his fault," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "Tonight I learned the truth. My husband died because another driver was impaired and following too close. It was an accident made worse by a scared boy's mistake." She gestured toward the house, where the baby's cries could be heard. "That young woman just became a mother in my living room. Her brother carried her through flood and storm to safety. Does that sound like a killer or someone trying to make things right?" The crowd wavered, their anger cooling in the face of her calm resolve. "The law will handle this when the road's clear," she said firmly. "Justice, not vengeance." One by one, the men began to leave, shame replacing righteousness. As the last truck disappeared, Lucía felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Not her grief for Tomás, but the guilt and anger that had consumed her. Inside, she found Matteo holding his sleeping niece. "Thank you," he whispered. "Because carrying anger alone was too heavy," she replied, "and she deserves a world where mercy matters more than revenge." "What will you name her?" Lucía asked Rosa. "Esperanza," Rosa smiled. "Hope." When the sheriff arrived the next day, Matteo told his story truthfully. The legal proceedings were fair. He received probation and community service. Tomás's death record was corrected to show the truth. He had been a victim, not at fault. Lucía stayed close to Rosa's family, becoming tia to little Esperanza, who grew up visiting the mountain house where she was born. The storm had washed away old grievances and planted seeds of healing. On quiet evenings, Lucía would sit on her porch remembering that sometimes our darkest storms clear the way for new growth. If this story touched you, if it reminded you that our greatest trials can become our most profound teachers, share it with someone who needs to hear that healing is possible. Sometimes choosing forgiveness over revenge is the bravest thing we can do. Thank you for joining this journey where rain, courage, and new life conspired to show us that hope can be born even in our darkest hours. "But he didn't," Lucía said. "Oh, quietly. No, he reported it as a single vehicle accident, made it look like your husband lost control all by himself. By the time I realized what Danny had done, the official report was filed, and your husband was being blamed for his own death. I was just a scared kid who didn't know how to tell the truth without destroying my own life. Another rock struck the house, shattering the remaining kitchen window. Glass scattered across the floor as cold air rushed in, making the candles flicker. "This ends now," Jim Peterson shouted. "Send him out, or we're coming in." Lucía stood, slowly, her mind clear for the first time in a year. "I'm going out there." "No," Mateo said desperately. "They're not rational. Someone could get hurt." "Someone's going to get hurt anyway," Lucía replied, looking at Rosa and her newborn daughter. "But it won't be this baby or her mother." She walked to the door with steady steps and opened it to face the angry crowd of 20 men with flashlights and makeshift weapons standing in her yard. "Mrs. Morales," Jim Peterson stepped forward. "We don't want trouble with you. Just send out the man who killed your husband." "He didn't kill my husband," Lucía said clearly, "and I should know." The crowd murmured in confusion as she stepped into the yard, rain falling gently on her face. "I've spent a year wondering if Tomas's death was his fault," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "Tonight I learned the truth. My husband died because another driver was impaired and following too close. It was an accident made worse by a scared boy's mistake." She gestured toward the house, where the baby's cries could be heard. "That young woman just became a mother in my living room. Her brother carried her through flood and storm to safety. Does that sound like a killer or someone trying to make things right?" The crowd wavered, their anger cooling in the face of her calm resolve. "The law will handle this when the road's clear," she said firmly. "Justice, not vengeance." One by one, the men began to leave, shame replacing righteousness. As the last truck disappeared, Lucía felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Not her grief for Tomás, but the guilt and anger that had consumed her. Inside, she found Mateo holding his sleeping. "Neat. Thank you," he whispered. "Because carrying anger alone was too heavy," she replied, "and she deserves a world where mercy matters more than revenge." "What will you name her?" Lucía asked Rosa. "Esperanza," Rosa smiled. "Hope." When the sheriff arrived the next day, Mateo told his story truthfully. The legal proceedings were fair. He received probation and community service. Tomas's death record was corrected to show the truth. He had been a victim, not at fault. Lucía stayed close to Rosa's family, becoming tia to little Esperanza, who grew up visiting the mountain house where she was born. The storm had washed away old grievances and planted seeds of healing. On quiet evenings, Lucía would sit on her porch, remembering that sometimes our darkest storms clear the way for new growth. If this story touched you, if it reminded you that our greatest trials can become our most profound teachers, share it with someone who needs to hear that healing is possible. Sometimes choosing forgiveness over revenge is the bravest thing we can do. Thank you for joining this journey, where rain, courage, and new life conspired to show us that hope can be born, even in our darkest hours.